It's time to do the Pennsylvania Polka, say hi to Ned Ryerson, and wake up to Sonny and Cher. That's right, get ready for 6 more weeks of winter because we are doing Groundhog Day, this time on Blind Spots and Second Thoughts. Hello again, and welcome to Blind Spots and Second Thoughts. I'm Dan.
I'm Heather.
And Heather, you are at least a little familiar with the movie for this episode, aren't you?
I am, yes.
So in this episode, we are covering 1993's Groundhog Day. Heather, what do you know about this movie?
This is a Bill Murray time loop movie.
Okay. This is Bill Murray in a time loop. What else do you know about it?
The time loop is Groundhog Day.
Takes place on Groundhog Day.
Yes.
Okay.
I think.
Anything else?
I assume it's set in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, because that is where the groundhog lives.
And that is near and dear to your heart as a Pennsylvania native.
Absolutely. Punxsutawney Phil. That's pretty much all I know.
Do you know anyone else in the cast other than Bill Murray?
No.
So I'm gonna name some names here. So we do have Bill Murray, the star of the movie. Andy McDowell is the second lead. We have Stephen Tobolowsky.
Okay, love him.
Chris Elliot.
Okay.
And Bill's brother, Brian Doyle Murray.
Okay, I know all of those people.
So what do you think will happen?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, typically in a time loop movie, which I have seen several others.
Which ones have you seen?
Most of which have been compared to Groundhog Day.
Sure.
I might spoil movies for other people if I talk about which movies are time loop movies.
I think it's okay to talk about which movies are time loop movies, but which ones have you seen?
I've seen Happy Death Day.
Okay.
A personal favorite as a horror fan.
That's been said that it's Groundhog Day as a horror movie.
Mm-hmm. I've seen, what was the movie that we watched with Andy Samberg?
Palm Springs.
I'm trying to remember if there are any others that I feel like there are, but those are the two that come to mind. My general impression of time loop movies, including those two, is that the plot typically revolves around the main character trying to right some wrong or fix some issue that they're having, and they're getting the chance to do things over and to learn from their mistakes. And so ultimately they can grow as a person because they've repeated this same day and have had this chance to try new ways of addressing whatever is going wrong in their life.
Okay. Any other guesses or anything else that you might or might not know about this movie?
I think there will probably be some groundhog slapstick.
I think that's a pretty good guess. So this movie, Groundhog Day, was directed by Egon himself, Harold Ramis, and released in February of 1993. Things that were happening around this time: Czechoslovakia had just split into the Czech Republic, or Czechia, and Slovakia. Bill Clinton had just been sworn in as the 42nd president of the United States. And a third thing, because my notes stopped there.
1993. I was probably learning cursive. I don't know. I was like, what's 7-year-old interests? That's how old I was in 1993.
So probably not something that you were like lining up to see in the theater.
No, certainly not.
I actually I do remember seeing this movie in the theater. So I was old enough to see this and to appreciate this movie.
Well, I think it's interesting to consider how young I was when the movie came out, just because I do think that even though I didn't see it then, because I was obviously too young and I never ended up seeing it, I grew up with this being in the world. And I think that's probably why I'm aware of it being a time loop movie, even though, again, never saw it.
I do think it's crazy that this is a movie that you've never seen, just because it's one of those movies that is like so deep in the pop culture fabric. As you mentioned, there's lots of movies that are described as Groundhog Day as a blank, or Groundhog Day with a blank, like with a certain twist. So it really is kind of the original. If it wasn't the original time loop movie, it's definitely the one that everyone associates with the time loop trope and that kind of idea of someone repeating a day over and over again. I guess we'll find out if it holds up and if you like it or not.
Yeah, let's see.
I'm sorry? What was that again?
I'm a god.
You're God.
I'm a god. I'm not the god. I don't think.
Because you survived a car wreck?
You folks ready to order?
I didn't just survive a wreck. I wasn't just blown up yesterday. I have been stabbed, shot, poisoned, frozen, hung, electrocuted, and burned.
Oh, really?
And every morning I wake up without a scratch on me, not a dent in the fender. I am an immortal.
Special today is blueberry waffles.
Why are you telling me this?
Because I want you to believe in me.
You're not a god. You can take my word for it. This is 12 years of Catholic school talking.
I could come back if you're not ready.
How do you know I'm not a god?
Oh, please.
How do you know?
Because it's not possible.
Doris. This is Doris. Her brother-in-law, Carl, owns this diner. She's worked here since she was 17. More than anything else in her life, she wants to see Paris before she dies.
Oh, boy, would I.
What are you doing?
This is Debbie Kleiser and her fiancé, Fred.
Do I know you?
They're supposed to be getting married this afternoon, but Debbie is having second thoughts.
What?
Lovely ring.
This is Bill. He's been a waiter for 3 years since he left Penn State and had to get work. He likes the town, he paints toy soldiers, and he's gay.
I am.
This is Gus. He hates his life here. He wishes he stayed in the Navy.
Well, I could have retired on half pay after 20 years.
Excuse me. Is this some kind of trick?
Well, maybe the real God uses tricks. You know, maybe he's not omnipotent. He's just been around so long, he knows everything.
Oh, okay. Well, who's that?
This is Tom. He worked in the coal mine until they closed it down.
And her?
It's Alice. Came over here from Ireland when she was a baby. She lived in Erie most of her life.
He's right. And her?
Nancy. She works in the dress shop and makes noises like a chipmunk when she gets real excited.
Hey!
It's true.
All right. So, Heather, now you have seen Groundhog Day.
I have.
What did you think?
I liked it. I thought it was pretty cute. It was an interesting watch because this is the first movie that we've watched for the podcast where I feel like I was prepared for the beats of the story. I was familiar with some elements of other movies we've watched, but this was really the first one where I knew where the movie was going to go because, as we talked about in the intro, it's really such a part of our culture that I knew what was going to happen.
Okay. But you liked the movie. You thought it was cute.
I did, yeah. I was wondering if you remembered from when the movie came out what the marketing was like and if you went into the movie knowing that there was going to be a time loop.
Yes. The marketing was very explicit on that he was going to live the same day over and over again. There were a lot of things I do remember. I think the scene when he kidnaps the groundhog and is driving with the groundhog in his lap and they drive off the cliff. I'm pretty sure that was in all the trailers. But I remember going into the movie because I did see this in theaters, knowing that this was going to be Bill Murray living the same day over and over again, which, you know, to be fair, like, how would you keep that a secret? I feel like that's the premise of the movie.
Right.
If not, like, otherwise it's just Bill Murray is a dick and a weatherman and they're in Pennsylvania.
That's a really good question of how else you would market the movie. But I remember when we watched Palm Springs, you did not tell me what the premise of the movie was, and I didn't know anything about it before we watched it. And I felt like there was really a benefit to me to not know that it was going to be a time loop movie. That surprise was very satisfying to realize that that's what was happening. So it's hard because, yeah, how do you market a movie that is about a time loop without revealing that that's what's happening? But at the same time, it's kind of an interesting experience to watch a movie and not know that that's what you should expect.
It is. And there are some, I've seen several movies that were like that where I did know going into it. I'm not going to name them now because there's at least two that I want to do for the podcast. So I want to try and keep you in the dark on those. But there are movies that I've been to where I knew it was a time loop and it's still a lot of fun because it's fun and you just know that it's, you know, Groundhog Day, but a blank. But then there's movies that I've been to or seen where I didn't know going into it. And then it was like, oh, and then it's really fun when that moment happens. But it's also because, you know, it's all in the context of Groundhog Day. There were a couple of short films that came before Groundhog Day that had a similar concept, but I believe Groundhog Day was the first feature film that really had this concept where it was somebody living the same thing over and over again. So really, from a movie perspective, Groundhog Day is the pioneer of this.
That's what I was going to ask, if you knew if this was the first one. It's interesting that being the first full-length feature, that it is a comedy, because when I think back to when I was trying to imagine what a time loop movie pre-Groundhog Day would have looked like, some of the things that come to mind, like this would be a good Twilight Zone episode. So something a little bit more spooky. And then, of course, there were horror movies that utilized the concept, but it is interesting that it's a comedy. But I just think that watching the movie, knowing what the concept is, and then having seen other movies that use time loops, it was an interesting watch to know that the movie is going to be about him learning how to not be a jerk through reliving the same day.
Right.
So
it's funny that you mentioned that. Tom Hanks was Harold Ramis's first choice for the part of Phil, but he turned it down because audiences would be waiting for him to be nice.
That's interesting.
And then also you mentioned the fact that it's a comedy. It's kind of a comedy. And that's actually one of the things that happened. This movie very famously led to the destruction of Bill Murray and Harold Ramis's relationship. They had been close and very good friends, but with Harold Ramis directing and Bill Murray being Bill Murray, over this movie, it led to their relationship being very hostile. They didn't speak for almost 20 years, although reportedly they did reconcile shortly before Ramis's death in 2014.
Wow.
But yeah, this movie, them having very strong feelings about what should be serious and what should be comic, and going back and forth on that. I don't remember exactly. I believe it was Ramis was pulling for the comedy and Bill Murray was pulling for the serious elements. And so they were able, I think, to find a good balance between the two. But yeah, that conflict apparently really destroyed their relationship.
That is true too, that it isn't really a comedy, or it balances drama and comedy. I think that I may be describing it as a comedy because that was the impression that I had about it before I saw it. And maybe that's just because it's Bill Murray, and so I expect him to be funny, but I always did think of it as being a comedy. But now that you're saying that, I'm reflecting back on it and realizing that it's not just comedic. There is definitely drama in there too.
How long do you think Bill Murray was trapped in the loop?
I was wondering that, honestly. It's hard to tell. A long time, it seemed like.
So people on the internet have guessed anywhere between 30 to 40 years based on some of the things like him learning the piano and all the memorization and things like that, to even more than 100 years or longer.
That's a horror movie. That is absolutely atrocious.
How well do you think you would fare in a time loop?
Oh, probably not well. I mean, there are things about it that I would probably enjoy, like knowing what to expect, because anticipation is the thing that always gets me. So being able to sort of be ready for what's going to happen, that sounds good. I did actually think
being in a time loop is really good for anxiety, apparently.
Yes. I did think about what I would do in a time loop, specifically what things Bill Murray does in the movie that I thought I would also do if I was stuck in a time loop. And it was eat all of the cakes, just all the time, all cake, and whatever food I wanted to eat. I'm thinking of the scene where he has an entire smorgasbord of desserts in front of him. I would impress people with my Jeopardy knowledge, quote unquote knowledge. And I would probably learn how to ice sculpt. That looked fun.
Oh.
That is, I think, even more so than playing the piano that well, him learning to ice sculpt does suggest a long period of time, because that's very tricky.
Yeah, you think?
I mean, to the level of detail that he was doing.
Also the one when he does Andy McDowell's face in snow.
Oh, yeah.
That's like, that had to take some time too.
It's interesting to think about how long it was, because I don't know, I'm thinking specifically of Happy Death Day, but something I kept reflecting on was similarities and differences with the other time loop movies that I have seen. And I feel like in some of them, there is more of a sense of how long it's happening, where the protagonist is keeping track of how many times they've relived the same day. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's just the impression that I've had. The other thing that I noted is that I think in future versions of time loop movies or media, there is an element of mystery to it. Like they're trying to solve the mystery of why they are repeating the same day. And it's only by solving the mystery that they can break the time loop. And that doesn't really seem to be the case here.
Yeah, this movie doesn't really do that. There's no explanation for why it happens or really why he gets out. It just sort of is a thing. It happens. He experiences it, and then the movie is over.
He theorizes to some extent. I mean, he does blame Punxsutawney Phil, the groundhog, for the time loop, and thinks that if he destroys...
Well, he does, but that proves to not be true.
Well, no, I know. I'm saying he, in terms of trying to figure out why it's happening, he plays with that a little bit, but it doesn't really go anywhere.
Right. No, the movie I don't think is interested in the mystery at all.
No, I would agree with that.
If I were in a time loop, I would go nihilist so fast. I would just lose. I would go to I called it his nihilism phase or the I am a god phase. And I would get there very, very quickly. You mentioned Happy Death Day. Happy Death Day, I recall, is a pretty limited number of loops. It's something like 7 or 8, and it's all like we're pretty much with her the whole time. There's no cutaway loops or anything like that.
I think that's right. I think that there might be montages of some speed runs of the loop, but we are seeing every loop that she's in, and how the loop restarts is also can be different depending on what movie you're watching. So in Happy Death Day, the loop restarts when she dies. In this one, it's 6 a.m. What was it in Palm Springs?
I don't remember the time. It was sometime at night.
So yeah, it seems to either be the time of day or, well, in a horror movie, it makes sense that dying would be the thing that restarts the loop. But that is why we know how many times she's gone through it, because every time she dies, it starts it over. And so we're seeing all of those deaths that she's experiencing.
Something else interesting about this movie, it was selected by the Library of Congress for preservation in the year 2006.
Oh.
So it's been deemed an important part of American culture.
I mean, I would agree with that. You'll get no argument from me, Library of Congress.
Heather approves. Library of Congress, Heather's thumbs up.
I know they were waiting for that.
All right, so let's talk about the movie. First of all, Andie MacDowell is adorable in this movie.
She's so cute.
She's
very
so much fun.
Sweet. She is very charming. And I really liked that the first time we see her, she's playing with the green screen or the blue screen for the weather map. And she's looking at herself being part of the clouds and things like that. It's very silly. But she's a producer, and we come to find out so much about her, and we find out that she has ambitions, and, you know, she stands up for herself, as I'm sure we'll get into when we're talking about some of the loops that he's going through. But I thought it was very relatable to me, because you know that I would do that exact same thing.
Yes,
play
you
with
would.
the weather screen. But I thought it was cool that, you know, she is charming, she's cute, she's silly, but she is also, you know, a pretty developed, fleshed out character. So I really appreciated that.
I don't know why, but I feel like I have always known who Chris Elliot is. Like, it's just this primal knowledge. I don't remember what I ever knew him from, but I even remember going to see this movie. I'm like, oh, Chris Elliot. And when I was like 11 years old, I was like, oh yeah, Chris Elliott's in this.
I don't honestly know what I know Chris Elliot from. I mean, now I know him from Schitt's Creek. He was one of the primary cast members on Schitt's Creek. But other than that, I mean, I also knew who he was before I watched that show. And I have this idea that I know him from a lot of things. But when I actually think about what they are, I don't know. And it is interesting because I had the thought watching this that his performance is pretty subtle here. And I think of him as being kind of an over-the-top actor. But I actually really liked his character.
He was fun. I wouldn't necessarily say, I would say his character is fun, but then the last loop, there's some moments where it's like,
They weren't too bad. I didn't think they were too bad.
He plays Larry in the movie, and I was very disappointed in Larry in the last loop. I think if I think about it, I probably knew him from his stint on Saturday Night Live. So that's probably where I knew him from. But even then, I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure if that's what I knew him from. It's just Chris Elliot. Everyone knows Chris Elliot.
Maybe he's time looping and we just have this weird ingrained deja vu about him. That doesn't actually make any sense, but you see where I'm going.
Mm-hmm. So the movie starts. We see a little bit the day before when they are getting ready to go to Gobbler's Knob. Pennsylvania is weird.
Mm-hmm. I mean, come on. I'm sure there are weirdly named places here.
Probably, but...
in Texas.
I'm just saying, Pennsylvania is weird.
Okay.
And then the movie pretty much just gets right to it. It starts with the first loop, which sets the tone for the day. He wakes up at the bed and breakfast. He is wrong about the weather. The weatherman very confident that they will not have a blizzard that ends up happening later on. He encounters Ned Ryerson, played by the great Stephen Tobolowsky.
He's great. Another person who I don't even know everything that I know him from. I just know him.
Yeah, I mean, he is. It's different than Chris Elliot, because Chris Elliot is, again, it's just one of those things where it's like, oh yeah, that's Chris Elliot. Whereas Stephen Tobolowsky was that guy who showed up and everything. And then finally it's like, I really like that guy. I'm going to find out his name. And so he was that guy who graduated to a character actor, basically. Yeah. Whereas Chris Elliot is just sort of this deep, primal, evolutionary, like our primate ancestors knew who Chris Elliot was, and it's just a genetic memory.
Yeah, that sounds right.
They go to the Groundhog ceremony with the Pennsylvania Polka playing in the background. Were you, as a Pennsylvania native,
I recognized it
with the Pennsylvania Polka?
It did sound familiar to me.
They try to leave. They hit the blizzard. They can't leave. So he has a drink at the bar at the hotel instead of going to the big party with everybody else. And then he has a cold shower at the bed and breakfast. And that's loop 1. So loop 2 then starts, and he's confused. He thinks it's just deja vu.
And then when he gets to the Groundhog ceremony, he's thinking, what is happening? And so he asks Rita to slap him, and she immediately does.
Right. She does not hesitate from slapping him. I wrote down that the cold shower gag is funny every time. Although it doesn't happen as much. You would think that it would be a running gag and it would happen. And I think it really is just a couple of times.
Yeah, I don't remember it being a big thing. Something that I noticed on the second loop is the guy that he runs into when he's leaving the bed and breakfast, or when he's leaving his room, I guess. The guy that asks him if he's going to see the groundhog and if he really thinks that there's going to be 6 more weeks of winter. He gets aggressive with him very fast. And I felt like that was different than the time loop things that I have seen, because I feel like in the second loop, the person who's experiencing it is so confused. They're just like, what is going on? And they're like scared. And he just grabs him and starts shaking him. I was like, this usually doesn't happen until like loop 3.
Right. No, he was very aggressive with that guy. I always get annoyed when characters are in a time loop movie and they don't reference Groundhog Day, because it's one of those things that it is a cultural touchstone. And it's one of those things that, like, even if you haven't seen Groundhog Day, if I said to you, "Are you Groundhog Daying?" then you would be like, "Oh yeah, no, I am. I'm definitely going crazy." Yeah. So, I always get annoyed about that, but I guess you can't really be annoyed at the characters in this movie for not knowing, since this movie hadn't existed before. One of the things I did like about loop 2 and I think loop 3, the polkas seem to sound a lot more sinister. And I don't know if they just tweaked it a little bit on the soundtrack and maybe played it in a slightly minor key, or if it's just the way that the polka sounds. But it sounded fine and friendly in the first and the last loops, but then every other time you hear it, it sounds very almost sinister and foreboding.
Oh, I didn't notice that.
But maybe it's also just the fact that it's a polka.
Excuse me. Let's watch it over there.
Sorry, am I insulting the song of your people?
Uh-huh. Polka is very important to us.
So one thing that I'm not 100% sure on, I don't know if he saw the doctor and the therapist in loop 3 or if there was a jump.
Oh, I assumed it was in the whatever loop he was already in, because he talks to Andy McDowell and she says, he tells her what's happening and she says, I think you need medical help. And then it cuts to him going to the doctor's office. And then the doctor tells him he needs a psychiatrist. And then it cuts to him in the psychiatrist's office. I assumed that was all happening in the same loop. And I even was thinking, you can't get in to see a psychiatrist that fast.
Right. Yeah. Just a random day in February and in the same day. That's why I was also like, I wonder if there was a loop there. Like he goes to see the doctor on one loop and the doctor's like, you need to see a psychiatrist. So he can't see the psychiatrist till the next day. So that's another loop.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that could be the case, but regardless of, it's all happening on one day, regardless of when the loops happen. And I just don't think he would be able to see a psychiatrist that fast. Although that psychiatrist was clearly very new to the profession, so maybe he didn't have any other patients.
That's entirely feasible, I think. He does freak out pretty quickly. I also think it's interesting that the movie spends more time explaining Groundhog Day because they figured not everyone in the world knows what Groundhog Day is than it spends explaining the premise. It really just gets right to him living the same day over and over again, and it expects you to keep up with it. But they spend a lot of time talking about Groundhog Day.
That is interesting, and I didn't think about that. I'm wondering now how much this movie did to make the actual holiday more well known, not just the time loop concept of Groundhog Daying, but just.
I will say, growing up in Texas, I did know what it was.
Okay.
So I wasn't unfamiliar with the concept. I don't know if I knew where the groundhog was, probably somewhere up in the Northeast. I don't know if I knew it was specifically in Pennsylvania in Gobbler's Knob.
Well, that I think was the little town center, maybe the name of the town center, because the city is Punxsutawney.
Okay.
And they do say Punxsutawney.
Yeah.
So I think Gobbler's Knob seemed like it was maybe like a little hamlet of Punxsutawney.
It's the suburb.
I mean, I should know, but it's Western Pennsylvania.
Right. No.
Oh, and that actually, that reminds me of something that I noted on his first loop when he is at the bed and breakfast. It's in the morning when he goes to get breakfast and he asks for espresso or cappuccino, and he's looking down on the proprietress very condescendingly because she doesn't know what he's talking about. And I was thinking, I don't think of Pittsburgh as being the big city, but then I thought, well, maybe that's just my Eastern Pennsylvania bias showing.
Look, you heard it here, folks, on Blind Spots and Second Thoughts for the Pittsburgh-Philadelphia rivalry. We are squarely Team Philadelphia, except when it comes to sports.
Then I don't care. I have no allegiance.
I also noted just the underlying grimness of the movie. It is funny, but sometimes the humor is very, very dark. I loved the line when he was talking to the drunk guy. He said, "What would you do if you were stuck in one place day after day and nothing you did mattered?" And the guy responds, "That pretty much sums it up for me."
Yeah, that was tough.
It was dark.
Very much so.
But yeah, no, if that was loop 3, if all of that is loop 3 and we're not missing another couple of extra loops, Phil does lose it real quick because at the end of that day is when he gets in the truck and he drives drunk and goes almost into the train and gets the cops to chase him. So he's already on pretty shaky ground.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess that makes sense, honestly. I can't remember how long it takes the characters in other time loop media, but you would, I think.
Yeah, but
pretty
also
quickly be like, what the hell is happening?
That is true. And it's also, again, it is impossible to imagine being in that situation and not having Groundhog Day as a reference because immediately, if that started happening to me, immediately I would be testing the rules and being like, all right, what can I do? How do I get out of this thing? Are there any changes? And like actually trying to gamify it basically and trying to figure it out. And again, but that's just having that touchstone. I feel like without having that touchstone, loop 3 is fairly early to start near suicidal behavior.
That's a good point.
Loop 4 is when he learns that there are no consequences. He punches Ned and he starts doing recon work on Nancy. He finds Nancy, thinks she's attractive, asks her a bunch of questions. So then in the next loop, he can hit on her.
I was a little worried at this point because I didn't actually know where that was going. I know I said earlier that I knew the beats of the movie, but I didn't know what it was going to do with that behavior. And so I was a little concerned because it was 1993. And there were a couple of things. There's a specific moment I'm thinking of that we will get to later that did not age super well. So I just was wondering, is the movie going to treat him appropriately for this chicanery?
How do you think
I think
that it did?
It did with Rita specifically, because he does then move on from Nancy to Rita. And when she figures out that he has been manipulating her, obviously doesn't know the extent of it, but realizes that he has been trying to manipulate her, it cuts to a montage of her slapping him.
Right.
And I was like, okay, I'm on board with this.
I think it's funny. He's known Rita for relatively short time at this point, but apparently he's already kind of obsessed with her because while he's sleeping with Nancy, he calls out Rita's name several times.
I didn't really buy that. I knew that Andie MacDowell was going to be the love interest. You know, it was pretty obvious that that's the direction that things were going to go in, but it didn't really make sense to me that he would, because they have not known each other for that long.
I mean, even then, he's known her for like an extra 6 days.
Right.
So like she's known him 2 and he's known her 6 or 7 at this point.
And their relationship seems very, I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily antagonistic, but it just seems very surface level. Like there's really no chemistry between them. And so I thought that seemed a little shoehorned.
Yeah, I feel like, again, that's a convention of the time. Like the movie just assumes that like she's the female lead, so they're going to get together. So just get on board.
Yeah, I didn't really blame the movie for it because I did assume that it was 1993. This is just how things were done. But looking at it, especially from a modern lens, I was like, this doesn't actually make sense. Why would he care? Why is he in love with her or obsessed with her?
Yeah, no.
Not that she's not great. It just didn't seem like he appreciated her
He didn't really have a crush on her. And also to get out of saying Rita's name out loud, he just proposes to Nancy and she just immediately says yes. Poor Nancy.
Nancy.
So this is when the movie really becomes unclear how many loops we've been through. If that was loop 5, then it gets very unclear after that. There's the armored car heist, which is fun. So he had to do at least to scout that out a few times. There's the time when he dresses up to go see a movie with some random woman.
Yes, don't even know who she is.
And then we begin the sequence that you just mentioned, that Phil is trying to seduce Rita. So he's approaching it again like he's save scumming a video game and just trying over and over again and iterating on seducing Rita. First of all, I've had vermouth. I don't think you have, but I've had vermouth and it is disgusting.
I've had martinis.
Yeah, but like by itself, because I've had it by itself.
No, I haven't had it by
so
itself.
Gross.
Yeah, it doesn't sound appealing.
One thing I did write down is 19th century French poetry is a major.
That doesn't sound right to me. As a higher education professional.
Right.
That seems very specific.
That is very specific.
I mean, poetry, perhaps. French studies, yes, because
French studies sounds made up too.
Now, that's quite enough out of you. I majored in French studies.
Oh, can you speak French?
Oui, un petit peu. Anyway, that is particularly specific. I mean, that could have been her area of interest. You know, she may have majored in poetry and her specialization was 19th century French poetry, but that wouldn't be on a diploma.
Right. And then how do you end up as a producer for a news team if that's your major.
I mean, it is not far-fetched to consider that college graduates go on to work in an entirely different field than what they studied.
No, it's not. But it is interesting that I wonder, especially in a very competitive field like that.
Mm-hmm. That doesn't seem...
Whose niece is she?
Yeah, she had no background, it sounds like.
Who throws snowballs at strangers? Is that a Western Pennsylvania thing?
I don't know. I'm from Eastern Pennsylvania. Totally different.
But yeah, that's a thing. That's a thing that happens in movies a lot where random kids start snowball fights. And I mean, to be fair, I can count the number of times that I've had snowball worthy weather in my life on my fingers and toes. So
I'm trying to think. I mean, I certainly never threw a snowball at a stranger when I was a child.
Well, yeah, but that's you.
I know. I never would. I don't think I threw snowballs at anybody, even people I did know. So I actually don't know, but I mean, kids can be little rascals. So I'm not ruling it out. I am 102.
I wrote down Rita's wallpaper vest.
I didn't notice the pattern, but it wearing a vest.
Yeah, she's wearing a vest and it looked like wallpaper to me.
It was the 90s.
It was the early 90s.
It was the early 90s.
The early 90s were definitely something else.
Mm-hmm.
He really loses his shit at that point. I do love, you mentioned the montage of slaps where it's like he isn't going to win. He cannot get to Rita through just pure seduction and fakery. And the movie makes that clear. So there's the montage of slaps. And then he enters his, what I call the nihilism phase.
I do want to comment on something else that happens in the trying to seduce Rita phase, which is not just her slapping him, because as we see at the end of the first full time that we see him doing that, she realizes that all of the sweet things he's been saying and all of the things that they have in common, that those were all tactics to try to sleep with her. But I also noticed, speaking of the kids throwing the snowballs, that Rita had told him that she wanted kids, that she wanted a man who wanted kids. And so he ramps up how he's interacting with the kids that are throwing the snowballs. At first, he's just having fun with them. And then when his first attempt at seduction doesn't work, he goes full... I don't even know how to describe it.
He really loses it.
He really does. And he says, "Oh, I wish you were my kids. Are any of you up for adoption?" And Rita is like, what is wrong with this guy? And I just really liked that moment because it also showed that, again, not only are his attempts to connect with her not working because they are not genuine, but it also just shows that you cannot win somebody over by just losing your mind.
Right. It's
about the things you think they want.
It's not a good look.
No, like more enthusiasm is not always the answer.
That's good advice from a 102-year-old woman.
I've been around. I know of what I speak.
So after his attempts to seduce Rita finally fail and he gives up, he enters the nihilism phase. He kidnaps Puxatawny Phil.
Did not like that.
Why?
Because he's so cute.
He's a groundhog.
He's so cute.
I really love that the mayor, played by Bill's brother, Brian Doyle Murray, personally chases Phil when he kidnaps the groundhog.
Which Phil?
Both of them.
They are together.
I think it's Rita who says, "Why would anyone kidnap a groundhog?" And Larry says, "I could think of a couple of reasons." And it's like, wait, what reasons are those,
and then,
Larry?
I think he caps that statement off with saying, "What a sicko."
Why is that what you're thinking, Larry?
Yeah, right. I actually had the same thought. I'm like, nobody was thinking that except for you.
Yeah, and you like Larry.
And I like Larry. Well, he's an animal lover in the appropriate way. In the appropriate way.
That's true.
Oh, Lord.
You just like sickos. That doesn't bode well for me. So he drives Puxatawny Phil off the cliff and dies. And that goes to the suicide montage now.
It is a good moment the first time when he drives off the cliff with Punxsutawney Phil, when Rita is aghast, and then Larry says he might be okay.
And then it blows up.
And then the car blows up. And I forget exactly what he says, but it's something like, well, not anymore.
I do think it's interesting that one of the conventions of this genre or this sort of subgenre are typically you are with the protagonist and you don't really get to experience things outside of the protagonist's perspective. But this movie, there's a few times when like that scene, and then there's a scene when they see Phil in the morgue and it's like, oh, he's long dead, but the movie breaks convention, although the movie was inventing convention, but that is unusual for this kind of movie. When you see, if you want to get super nerdy about it, you have to wonder, like, does the universe reset and it keeps going so he's actually dead until 6 a.m. or is it just sort of is that just for the audience? I don't know. It's you can't really think too hard about it.
No, I don't want to. But it is an interesting question. Maybe they gave us moments of seeing other people's reactions. I mean, it really just seems to be Larry and Rita, and we're getting their reactions. And maybe that was just to give Chris Elliot a chance to be funny, because he does also have some lines in the morgue scene where he says he was a really good guy. I really liked him. I liked him a lot.
I do want to know, when he talks about all the ways that he died, he says he was hanged, and it's not implied that he hanged himself. So I want to know how he got hanged. If someone else hanged him. Is that also a Western Pennsylvania thing? Do they still?
Yes.
Okay, so that's don't commit capital offense or groundhog theft in Western Pennsylvania.
100%.
Something I learned when I was writing down notes for this is I don't know how to spell Pennsylvania.
Well, this is a problem.
And then after a while, it just starts to like lose all like this. It stops looking like a word.
That's why we say we're from PA.
Do you really?
Yeah, a lot of people do.
That's funny. So the end of the nihilism phase is the I am a god loop. And that actually leads to a very nice day with Rita, where he's just stopped trying. He's given up. He's at the end of his metaphorical rope, since he's been at the end of a literal rope, apparently.
Very good.
And he's not really trying, but he's also given up on dying as well. And that leads to...
That was beautiful. Very poetic.
Thank you. Well, it's not 19th century French poetry, but I try. So yeah, he has this very nice time with Rita, and they actually do bond. And that actually makes a little bit more sense, I think, from the movie's perspective. Then at that point, that's when they do show that they have chemistry and they do get along well. So it didn't necessarily make sense early on that he would be mildly obsessed with her or call her name out. But like now it's like, okay, he can see that he actually does have a crush on her. He's not just like trying to seduce her. He actually has a genuine connection with her. And then it's actually very sad when the time rolls over and she's gone.
Yeah.
And the day does reset.
Yeah, that was the moment when you see him wake up and realize that she's gone. Was pretty heartbreaking. It didn't start out authentic, but it does become authentic. I would agree with that. But this is a question, not a question really, but something that I was thinking about was trying to consider how I would feel if somebody in my life was time looping. Like if somebody who always behaved a certain way one day just started acting totally different, would you really buy it?
I mean, she's known him for one day, and like she seems like she's genuinely concerned with people. Like even on the other loops, I mean, she doesn't hesitate to slap him, but she also shows genuine concern for him and for other people. So you could extrapolate that she's a caring person and she's genuinely empathetic, but she doesn't know him that well. Like she's met him, they've had the ride from Pittsburgh, and maybe he was just in a surly mood. So like she doesn't really know.
Well, you say she's known him for a day, but it sounds like she's been around at the station for a little bit, but he just hasn't worked with her directly.
Right. Well, it seems like, I mean,
like
they're
gone on
introduced,
a story with her.
But they're introduced at the beginning of the movie,
Oh,
right?
they are? Okay.
It seems to be, the way that the other character is talking about her makes it sound like they are being introduced or they haven't really worked together before. And the way that he's talking to her about talent should do this and blah, 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 and you should do this. So they've definitely never worked together before. So that if they spent any time together, it wasn't significant.
Okay.
All right, so then they get to the Enlightenment phase, and this is when he's trying to improve himself and make life better for everyone else in this time loop. So that's the Enlightenment loops. He starts learning things. He learns the piano. He starts doing piano lessons. There's the sequence where he becomes fixated on the old homeless man called Pop and trying to save him, but it looks like there's just nothing he can do. And basically in every loop, Pop is going to die.
Yeah, talk about grim.
Yeah, that is very
was a
grim.
very sad sequence.
It does seem very, I guess, Buddhist in a way of sort of like, accept that some things you can't change and there is everyone dies. I think it's like the nurse at the hospital says something like, sometimes it's just his time.
He asked what he died from and she said he was just old. It was his time. And then he wants to see the chart, presumably to be able to fix whatever the issue is to save him in the next loop. And the nurse says, sometimes people just die. And he says, not today. But then it shows that, every day he is trying some different things, it seems like, but he still dies at the end of every loop. Very sad.
I think it's interesting because when you talk about it now, it fits where it is within the movie. But then if you think about the ending in the last loop, it's like, well, that's a little grim. Yay, there's kind of a happy ending, but also there's a dead man.
Well, that's true. But I think that the point of including that in the movie is to suggest that things do just happen. And that is life. That's part of life as well. Life is happy and sad.
So the Enlightenment phase leads to what I would call the superhero phase, where he's not only just enlightened, but he's going out of his way to help as many people as he possibly can within the loop. And one thing that I think is interesting, the movie doesn't really let you know ahead of time that you're in the last loop. Like you're experiencing things and then it's just like, oh, that was the last loop. Okay. There's no hat tip and there's no sort of, dramatic foreshadowing or anything like that.
Right. And that goes along with the difference with this movie that there isn't a mystery as to why he's time looping. So I feel like in other things that I've seen, the characters figure out the mystery and they think, okay, well, now I'm going to do this and this and this to try to break the loop because I think this is what's causing it. But without that, he's just doing the same things and then it just ends. Spoiler.
Right. Well, we finally do get to see the party. We didn't see the party. I wondered, what if the only reason that he was in the time loop was because that's the first time he ever went to the party?
Oh, yeah.
He's been skipping out on the party for 100 years. He finally decides to go to the party, and that's all he had to do.
That's what he had to do. Well, there's a bartender character in the movie. Doesn't have his line. He's at the bar where Phil buys Rita drinks every night and learning a little bit more to then tailor the experience. And there's a bartender there who I think was also in an earlier scene where he's listening to the conversation and he's just sort of shaking his head. And I had this whole alternate reality where he was also time looping and sort of supervising this situation and just sort of watching what Bill Murray is doing in the time loop. So he's aware of them as well. I made this all up in my head. But he seemed so knowing and so just interested in what Bill Murray was doing. It's like he would shake his head at his manipulation. And I'm like, well, why is he shaking his head at that? Unless he knows that it's not real. Anyway.
Maybe just because the idea was that it came off insincere. Because that's during the Rita seduction, right?
Yes. But no, you're wrong. I'm right. And perhaps he was also bartending the party. And so it was all his doing. Sorry.
Are you all right?
No.
So it was a bartender with no lines was the
Yes,
The culprit,
mastermind
the
of
mastermind
the whole
behind it all.
situation.
I think it's funny in the last loop we see, first of all, Larry, again, your favorite character.
I didn't say he was my favorite character.
Such a nice guy.
I'm sorry, he's very inoffensive, I think.
He leaves a fake tip.
Oh.
He puts money down so Nancy can see it. And then as soon as she turns around, he takes it back.
Oh, I must have missed that both times I watched it because, okay, I take back everything I said. That actually really does put things in a totally different perspective because everything else I was like, okay, he doesn't seem to realize that Nancy isn't interested in spending time with him, but he's not being super pushy. So I was like, all right, he's maybe a little clueless, but
Right, no, his fake tip.
okay, that is, yeah, okay. I'm very sorry. I retract my previous praise of him.
I also think it's funny because
But I never said he was my favorite character.
Phil was able...
My favorite character is Punxsutawney Phil. Let's
Right.
be clear.
Phil was able to get Nancy to agree to marry him after, from her perspective, one night. And Larry gets nowhere.
I didn't understand it. And maybe you're about to talk about the Bachelor auction as part of this last scene. But Bill Murray had been doing all the like good deeds for the town, like making a name for himself. And Larry hadn't done any of that. But, you know, I'm just like, they're equal to me attractiveness wise. So I didn't understand why he went for so much money and Chris Elliot only went for a quarter.
Right. Well, it's also funny because they're not from there.
Yeah.
So I can kind of understand when you see all of the things that Bill Murray did throughout the day. Although one of my favorite bits was like when he saves the mayor's life and then immediately lights the woman's cigarette. It's like, well, you're making everyone's lives better, but you're helping kill that woman.
Well, it was the 90s. You could still smoke in restaurants. Nobody knew.
Yet nobody knew in the 90s that cigarettes caused cancer. It was, no one knew.
All right, fair enough. But it was still the norm.
No, it wasn't.
I mean,
It wasn't the norm.
no, all right. I don't know. I was a child. What do I know? I remember when restaurants switched from having smoking sections.
Sure. No, they had smoking sections.
In my lifetime, that people were still smoking in restaurants.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I just think it's funny because he's helping everyone else, but then he's also like...
Well, it's not malicious.
It's not malicious, but it is funny because it's like, well, that is objectively helping her to die. It is funny, though, that there's a bachelor auction. So you think about all of the things that Bill Murray's been doing throughout the day. Everyone in the town has, in theory, gotten to know him in a day, and they're all like very excited about it. But Larry is just this guy from out of town. So why would anyone bid on him? And why would he even want to? Because he's not going to be there in theory.
I guess that's true.
He's going to go back to
The excitement went to his head.
Pittsburgh.
He saw how much money Bill Murray went for, and he thought that he was going to get in on that too.
So at this party that's full of white people dancing in just the weirdest ways, again, Western Pennsylvania, I don't know.
Me either.
All of a sudden, hello, it's Michael Shannon.
Yes, baby Michael Shannon.
This was apparently, according to IMDb, this was his first named role.
Aw, good for him. He did appear in an earlier scene, but you don't really see him.
I wrote down what the amount was. Oh, the amount that Phil goes for at the Bachelor auction was $339.88, which I thought is such a very specific amount of money. And I'm like, is that just her checking account? Is that like all of her money?
God, I hope not.
It's such a specific amount, but also I'm like, well, what is it in 1993 dollars? Apparently it is $642.57. So again, hopefully that's not like all of her money.
No, I would hope not. I assumed maybe it was the cash she had on her, but that seems like
No,
a
it's
lot.
a check. She has a check.
She has a check?
Yeah.
Did I watch this movie?
It's a very specific amount though.
Yeah, for a check? Yes.
But then after that night, after Rita bids on Phil to win the bachelor party, then
The Bachelor auction. The Bachelor party.
after Rita bids on Phil to win the bachelor auction, they have their very nice time outside, and then they go back to Phil's hotel room, and the time loop ends. He escapes out of it, and that's it.
Yeah.
The movie pretty much just ends after that.
They're going to move to Punxsutawney.
Yeah, they're going to move to Punxsutawney, or they say that in passing. But that's it. Like, the movie's just over. You don't really know what the mystery was. You don't really deal with the psychological fallout of one man having 100 years worth of memories. Like, is he even going to remember where he lives at this point?
Oh my God, that's such
like, think about all the things from real life that he would have forgotten.
I cannot accept that he was in the time loop for 100 years. It will break my brain.
Like, he gets back to Pittsburgh and he's like, God, I haven't seen this in so long. And everyone's like, what is wrong with you? You were just here.
That's so depressing.
I would have a very hard time after being in a time loop. Aside from just going full feral almost immediately, if I ever did get out of the time loop, I would have a very hard time processing that I was no longer immortal after the time loop. I would have gotten used to just wandering around everywhere and not really caring if I died, or like, if I got a paper cut, just, then just shooting myself in the head to reset the loop or something like that.
God.
So I would have a very hard time adjusting to the fact that, like, oh yeah, no, now I need to be mortal again and be normal.
Yes. And even if you don't think about it from the perspective of immortality, just not having consequences for your actions, it's a little tamer than shooting yourself over a paper cut, but it still is, something that you would probably get used to, being able to just do whatever and not worry about it.
So that's it. That's Groundhog Day. That's the movie.
Why Groundhog Day?
I don't know.
I was wondering if there was a reason for that. And also the fact that he's named Phil and
I'm sure
Groundhog
that's
is
intentional.
Phil. No, I'm sure that is intentional. It's not really referenced. There is a passing moment where somebody calls him by name, and then it's one of the two drunk guys at the diner, I guess, says, Phil, like the groundhog? And he says, yes, like the groundhog. But that's really the only reference to it. But I was just wondering if you thought there was any deeper meaning. I mean, it's not necessarily the case, but I was thinking about, the futility of the groundhog coming out year after year to look for its shadow when winter is going to be winter, no matter what a groundhog sees, or, it's all just spectacle without any real meaning to it. And so I wondered if there was some symbolism there.
I don't know. I mean, it's a catchy title. It's a fun holiday that's not really a holiday. It's a fun setup. It gets them to the small town, which if it was some other kind of holiday, like, why would they have an excuse to be there? I don't know. I don't know if there was a reason. I didn't come across it when I was looking stuff up.
Okay, well, maybe I'm just overthinking it. Phil the groundhog is in captivity. They just keep him until he has to come back out the following year. I mean, I'm sure they treat him well, but it's like that's his life. So
it's like a rumination on the movie is a rumination on doing the same thing over and over again, and they chose Groundhog Day because the mascot of Groundhog Day is a Sisyphean rodent forced to perform year after year in a meaningless ceremony.
Yes, exactly.
For strange Pennsylvanians.
No, I'm going to get angry.
Final thoughts on the movie?
I don't have any final thoughts. No, I did like it. It was something I was familiar with. I knew what was going to happen. I knew that he was going to start out unlikable. He was going to learn some lessons. He was going to end up more likable, fall in love with Andie MacDowell. But it's a classic for a reason. It kicked off a subgenre for a reason. And I thought it was very well done and I enjoyed it.
Okay. Well, I am glad we finally got to watch it together. And now we can finally watch that episode of Smarty Pants on Dropout.
Yes, looking forward to that for sure.
Thank you all for listening. Once again, I am Dan.
I'm Heather.
And this has been Blind Spots and Second Thoughts.